Hey y'all, I'm Robbie Wheaton. Today, I'm going to walk you through the process of how to install a trigger on your trigger bar. Let's head on in the shop and get started. All right y'all, today I'm going to walk you through the process of how to install an aftermarket trigger shoe on your trigger bar for your Glock pistol. Now, this process will work with a Wheaton Arms Elite Pro Carry trigger, as well as any other trigger system that has a pin that you have to drive in. Before we get started, let's talk about a few things that we'll call your do's and your don'ts. And then once we head over to the bench, I'm going to show you exactly what I'm talking about. So we'll start with the don'ts first. The first don't is do not use a punch to try and drive the roll pin in to your trigger assembly. 9 times out of 10, the punch is going to slip. You're going to have a big gouge in the side of your brand new trigger. Nobody wants that. So don't use a punch. Just use the hammer to tap the pin in and tap it in flush. And I'm going to show you how to do that shortly. The second big don't is don't set the trigger assembly on your wooden workbench or synthetic workbench or whatever and try and drive the pin in off of the bench top. The bench is going to flex and it's not going to allow enough resistance against the trigger and the pin for it to drive in properly. You'll end up flaring the pin or bending the pin and it won't go in. The third big don't is don't try and use a phenolic plastic spacer or bench block to set your trigger shoe on to drive the pin in. Once again, you're going to run into the same issue that you had trying to drive the pin in on just a wooden or phenolic workbench. The pin's going to end up flaring, it's going to bend, it's not going to go in. So now let's talk about the do's. The biggest do when you install your trigger pin is to set the shoe on top of a steel vise. That way you've got something solid for the pin to rest against. And then take a mallet, or I use like an 8-ounce steel ball peen hammer, and I don't use the ball end, I use the flat end. And I lightly tap the pin and the pin just drives right in, no problem. And I'm gonna demonstrate that process to you. But first, I'm gonna demonstrate the don'ts and why they don't work. We're going to walk through all the don'ts on the bench. I'm going to show you why they don't work. And then we're going to move over to the steel vise. And I'm going to show you the correct way to install the trigger pin the first time so you don't have any issues whatsoever. Now let's head over to the workbench and get started. All right, so you can see I've got one of our old trigger shoes here. This is a Blim. Somebody tried to drive in with a punch and I've already slipped, dinged it up. We just replaced it for our customer because we're good about standing behind our products, so that's what we do. You can see the trigger pin's already in. It's driven in just below flush, so everything should install perfectly easy. No problem at all. We got a little roll on the top edge where the punch slipped, but that's not going to affect what we're doing today. So we're all set up, ready to go here. Now the first thing we're going to do, we're going to set it down on the bench, and you can see the pins protruding out a little more than 1/8 of an inch. We're going to set the shoe down on the bench, and what a lot of guys will do, they'll take their hammer. You can see here just a little 8-ounce ball peen. I use this hammer a lot. This is my favorite hammer. And then they'll take a punch, something like this, and they'll try and drive the pin in with a punch. You can see when you set everything down, the pin's not moving. Eventually it's going to slip. You're going to end up with a big gouge in your trigger like we've got here. Next thing, the customer's going to say, well, the punch isn't working. I'm just going to switch to the hammer. And they go to beating on the pin. Right? Pin hasn't moved. Everything's still exactly where it was because the wooden workbench flexes and it doesn't allow enough resistance against the shoe for that pin to drive in. Next thing, you get the customer, he gets his little phenolic bench block, got his trigger shoe, brand new trigger shoe, sets everything up, boom, he's going to install it, grabs his mallet, starts banging away on it, or he uses a punch, bangs away, slips, gouges his trigger. Once again, pin hasn't moved. That pin is locked in place, right? Then I get the phone call, or other companies get the phone call that say, hey, I got this trigger shoe, the pin's stuck, I can't get it in, I can't get it out, nothing's moving, what am I supposed to do? All right, now I'm going to walk you guys over to the vise, and I'm going to show you the proper way to install this pin simply, easily, the first time, so you have no issues whatsoever. So let's move over to the vise and get started. So here I've got one of my steel Kurt vices. This flat area here is going to be the area where we're working. So now I've got everything set up on our vise here. We've got the steel surface for us to work around. One of the first things I like to do, you notice all vices always have, there's like some imperfections and stuff. Get a paper towel and wipe it off, clean it real good. And then get a piece of printer paper and lay a piece of printer paper on top of your vise. So you've just taken your Glock apart for the first time. You're getting ready to put an aftermarket trigger shoe in. You've got your trigger bar out of your Glock, just a regular OEM trigger bar. You're sitting here, you're looking at it, and you're like, how is this shoe supposed to come off, right? If you look closely, you'll see there's a pin here, right? You can see that pin. Flip it over. Nothing on the back side. It's a what's called a blind pin. So we've got to take this pin out to remove the trigger bar from the trigger shoe. So we'll just set my little block up here. The only reason I'm using this one, it's steel, gives me plenty to drive against. I've got a hole in it. Trigger goes on. I set my punch right on top of that. Camera angle out a little bit. See if we can get you guys a little better view so you can see what I'm doing here. Trigger, punch goes right on that hole. Actually, I'm just going to grab a little smaller punch and make it easier. Goes right on your pin here. Just tap it down. You can see how, blow everything up a look in. There we go. Now you can see how the pin actually came out the side. There we go. That's better. You can see how the pin came out the side. I've got my little punch here that I made. I just take my punch out. There's where the pin was. Drop everything. There we go. There's where the pin was. There's where we drove it out the back side. And now here's our trigger bar ready to go on our trigger shoe. Or if you decide with your OEM trigger bar, you can polish it, prep it, do any kind of work to it that you want now that you've got it off of your trigger shoe prior to installing the trigger bar on your new trigger shoe. So now we're going to take our new trigger bar. We're going to move everything over to the edge of the vise. Here we go. Center everything up for you guys. Move our trigger over to the edge of the vise, and the trigger bar is going to go right in the slot in the rear. Just like that. Just slide it all the way in until it stops. And I actually prefer to hold the trigger bar instead of the shoe when I'm driving the pin in. I think it makes everything a little bit easier. So now we're going to take our mallet. I'm going to give our pin a couple of taps. Wiggle it. Make sure your pin hole's lined up. We're not quite there yet. Couple of taps. There we go. All right, so we can see here our pin's lined up. Everything's starting in. Set it back up on the edge of the vise. Tap the pin in. That's it, guys. That's all there is to it. Pins drove in. The pin doesn't have to be in any further than flush on this side right here. So you drive your pin in until it's flush and you're done. You don't have to countersink it or anything. Just flush is fine. That gives you plenty of contact. Everything moves like it's supposed to. Everything works like it's supposed to. Quick and simple. That steel vise gives you enough reinforcement and support where you tap in on that pin, the pin drives right in. Don't try and use a punch. Don't try and use anything, any kind of blocks or anything like that. Set it on top of the edge of your steel vise and just tap the pin in and it goes right in. I hope this video helped you out with learning how to install a trigger bar and a trigger shoe together with one another the correct way the first time. Follow the processes and you will not have any issues at all installing one of the Wheaton Arms trigger shoes or any other aftermarket trigger shoe that you have to drive a pin through to get into your trigger bar. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, make sure to like and subscribe below. See you next time.